Hi, everybody. I'm Maria Cristina Capelo, or MC. I am the head of the
Hello, everyone.
For Latin America. And it is my pleasure to have here with me Mimi Ito. In a second, we'll go and introduce her properly, but I did want to first welcome all of you. Thank SaferNet for yet another stellar production for Safer Internet Day and for having this opportunity to chat about youth and kids and well-being. And I think you will very much appreciate the conversation that we have for you today. As for me, what you're seeing, I'm wearing long hair and it's brown. My glasses are bright green. I have a little collar necklace in a white shirt. And behind me, you'll see a cacti painting that my mom happened to do. So now that you've seen my description or that you've heard my description, I'm ready to jump in. So welcome, Mimi. Mimi is from the University of California, from the Connecting Learning Alliance. And I'll read a little bit about her bio. She is a cultural anthropologist, learning scientist, entrepreneur, and an advocate for connected learning. What is that? It's learning that is equity-oriented, centered on the interest of youth, and that is socially connected. Her work focuses on decoding precisely digital youth culture for parents and for educators, and offering ways to tap interests in digital media so that youth can be more engaged in learning, so that learning becomes more relevant and socially connected. As I said, she's the director of the Connected Learning Lab and professor in residence and John D. and Catherine MacArthur Foundation Chair in Digital Media and Learning at the University of California, Irvine. She's also co-founder of Connected Campus, which is a nonprofit providing online learning experiences for kids in all walks of life. Mimi, welcome, very much welcome. I will throw a couple questions at you first, but maybe if you want to just say a few words, do your description, and we'll dive right in.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. And I'll start also by just giving my visual description. I have medium length, mostly black hair with some white pandemic era white hair showing through. I have dark glasses and I'm wearing a minimalist dark suit, and my background is mostly white with sunshine from Southern California streaming through.
Wonderful. So Mimi, thank you for joining us over in Brazil. Brazil is one of my favorite places in Latin America to learn and to deep dive on this. We have a lot of very lively discussions around the use of technology among youth and about how they are actually becoming very much digital citizens. And so my first question for you is the following. We have a lot of discussions here around screen time. That's been especially the case during the pandemic, and as I'm sure you've seen around the world. And one of the things that comes up over and over in our conversations is the use of digital media and well-being, of teens, of kids, and some concerns that all of us have from different perspectives as parents, as a parent myself, as educators, and as society between sort of the highlights, right, that come with the use of digital media, and how do we focus on this debate beyond just the use of beyond just screen time, right? Like how much time are teens and kids spending online, and some of those more deterministic conversations. How do we expand those to take account of the educational and health and well-being debates that are happening around the world? So if you can help us with your research and your understanding, I think that would very much help us in our debates in Brazil.
Yeah, thanks for starting off with sort of this big issue that I think is in people's minds when they think about technology and young people. A lot of how our concerns and worries about our children and our students have use of technology have been filtered through this idea that screen time is generally bad, and our role as parents and educators is to limit use, and we're often judged in our parenting about how good we are as a parent and how effectively we manage screen time and we sort of implicitly judge the families who are letting their children have an iPad at a dinner table and other things, or letting their kids play video games while they get some work done. So I think it's really important first to acknowledge that, those concerns, the fact that, we worry and don't always have access or understanding about what our kids are doing on their computers, are really deeply motivated in positive ways. Often when we have generational experiences, we didn't grow up with iPads and with immersive video games. And so there's a really, new kind of parenting challenge that arises when our generational experiences are quite different from our children's. And it's natural that we have sort of concern and anxiety that is focused on that actual device and the kid looking at a screen. But I do feel like it's gotten to the point where that notion of time on screen itself is really getting in the way of us really understanding, appreciating, and being able to positively support young people in their engagement with technology. There's two real problems that we see, and it's not just me, most researchers doing work in this field, I think would agree that the first problem is that an exclusive focus on the actual device really detracts from attention to what the real drivers are for young people's anxiety, stress, social problems. And there's a long-standing tendency, whether it was television or whether it's screens today, for us to fixate on the new thing because it's unfamiliar and a bit scary. And while that's valid, as I've described, the problem is it tends to detract attention from the things that are actually causing stress, anxiety, and distress to young people. So when we talk to, so the research is really clear that what drives mental health issues is fairly well known. It's things like poverty, racism, big structural issues, economic disparities, and then everyday issues like, conflict within the family or drama among friends, the stress of having to do well in school. When we talk to young people, it's like, what stresses you out? It's like homework, school, the fight I had with my friend, the fact that my parent won't get off my back about X, Y, and Z. These are the drivers of stress, right? Or lack of resources, hunger. And trying to position technology as both the cause and solution of those fundamental problems is really has an unfortunate side effect of us silencing or ignoring those broader drivers. Now, it is important to look at how technology can amplify some of these problems. It's also, and this is where our work at the Connected Learning Lab has emphasized, it's really important to also look at how technology can help support young people. So when we talk to young people, they say, oh, I was really stressed out about school. And they may be scrolling through a TikTok video because they're procrastinating or feeling anxious. And then their parent comes in and yells at them for being on TikTok instead of doing their schoolwork, and they take that phone away. Or say there's social drama and a kid is anxious about their friendship and they're online texting with their friends to try to get social support. And then again, you're not doing your homework. Let's take the phone away. In both of those cases, the phone is providing actually a valuable source of social support, distraction, calming, and it's not the source of the anxiety or the problem. So I think that's where it's like, take a step back and really, parents know their children, so focus on those underlying drivers rather than the technology. And then the related problem is that focus on screen time leads us to bad solutions, as I've described, like the solution being to take the phone away when a kid is having anxiety because of schoolwork is not an appropriate solution. And parents have been advised for quite some time that they should be focusing on time. And what that does is it puts the parent in the role of a time monitor and cop, like somebody who says no, rather than as a media mentor who may be involved in your young person's digital interests, may have genuine curiosity about the games they're playing or the social accounts and influencers that young people are following. And it creates this sort of negative and judgmental dynamic between parents and children around their technology engagements that really sort of makes conversations difficult. It's a focus on quantity rather than quality, but I think it's had a quite negative side effect in creating a rift between parents and children about technology use.
This is very enlightening. So I'm taking away, I am stealing your media mentor reference here. I have a 5-year-old, or it's actually, he just turned 6-year-old sitting around here because COVID closed schools again for a while. And he's on his iPad. You must have seen him. So I sometimes am like, I need him to be like there for like an hour. And I feel bad about it. And you're right. It's not so much about the time, right? I'm hearing that this is about how do I become a better mentor for him when he's actually using the apps that I allow for him, and how do I accompany him through that journey. I'm hearing that fixation is not helping us have the better debates about underlying issues and about how social media can, or not even social media, that's not what I meant. Internet platforms or any of the services that they can access can be drivers for even better conversations sometimes. Here he is. So the next question is actually, I'll do a twofold here for you. So one of the findings of your report is precisely thinking about social media and youth well-being. And you've highlighted some of the uses of the social media apps that promote well-being. You were mentioning a couple. And I would love some of those examples and those surprising engagements that you found with digital media in the positive outcomes for teens especially, right? Like how can we think of instead of, like you say, becoming sort of the time screen police, how do we enable these positive outcomes for teens? And then after that, I'm going to move on to a different kind of audience, which is teens that don't have yet enough access to all of these technologies, right? And vulnerabilities. So let's go with the positive examples, and then we'll move a little bit over to that other conversation.
Sure. And I love that your son is making a cameo in this talk. It's very appropriate to the times of the conversation. So I think a lot of the work that we do at the Connected Learning Lab is really, starting with young people and their engagements. And that's sort of the connected learning model, is rather than like swoop in from the outside and say, adults have the solution and here's how you do it. We really try to take a beat and work in partnership with young people and really listen and learn from the positive engagements that they already have. So I've been inspired, for example, by the positive deviance methodology in public health, where rather than, in international aid efforts, swooping into communities and airlifting resources and technical knowledge, they sit with communities and try to find folks who are thriving within the same ecosystem and elevating the voices and approaches that young people, or not in my case, young people in public health, different communities are doing, and empowering leaders within those communities to spread those positive practices. So that's sort of the approach that, especially around technology, is quite important, because young people have a skepticism about adult fluency around technology, and all these screen time issues have made it worse because not only are adults clueless, they're judgmental about technology use. So there's an inherent skepticism about learning from adult authority in these spaces. So this work, the messenger matters, and we know it's not just youth, it's peers who are influential for us, for young people, but especially for young people around technology use. Because they see their parents doing all the same, behaviors and being judgmental of them on top of it. So what we did in our report is, we reviewed the research, and, my research area before I was doing this work on well-being is really around digital youth culture. And we tried to look at practices that young people were doing already, which were super awesome from a well-being perspective. And we found that it was already happening, that they described how, when they're having a bad day, they might put things out there and they get social support from their friends. One of our co-authors on this report, Candace Odgers, and her team has studied like how helpful it is for young people going to college and leaving home for the first time to be able to text their parent when they're having a stressful day. And that's just amazing. Like, it's pretty commonsensical, but it's like, you're having a bad day and you're away from home and mom and dad, and now they can actually text in a lightweight way at the moment that that stress is happening. A lot of young people in more vulnerable or stigmatized identities like queer youth or youth in sort of religious or racial or ethnic minorities talk about how incredibly important social media and influencers online have been to be positive sort of leaders, advice blogs of how to navigate some of the complexities and challenges of queer identity or being in a minority identity. These are all things that young people have described as absolute lifelines to promote a sense of positive identity, body positivity, influencers. These are other examples. But even if it's not, a person directly who's giving you direct personal support, the fact that the online and social media world is so vast and diverse has meant that young people can find role models, online mentors who can speak to their particular identities and issues in ways that might not be available in their local environment. So those are just a few examples of things we've learned from young people.
That's wonderful. And I especially like the component of asking them, that you as an explorer of digital youth culture, right? And it's not what we find useful, it's what they find useful. And how do we integrate those experiences? Give me 1 second. Hay una caja allá atrás. Búscala y después hablamos. And dealing, with how do we enable those experiences? And I liked that you point something out. We usually have the same behaviors. Sometimes we avoid our emotional reality by going online and doing, some shopping or whatever. So it's more like a human behavior thing, and how do we connect to each other? And so you also mentioned now the importance of these online connections that can then become presential or in presence or not, but for different communities or different youth that belong to different communities and are minorities themselves. And so one of the things that we saw in the pandemic, and this is especially true in Brazil, in Latin America, is we could really clearly see social and economic inequities and inequalities reflected in how youth and kids actually had access to the internet. So just not just the equipment, right? But services, the types of interactions, sometimes the languages that resources were out there in to support, right? In the most difficult moments. So especially for educators who work in public schools, and is there anything that they should be considering that's different in terms of the different vulnerabilities of their students, or for parents as well, right? And how do we move forward in creating some of these resources?
Yeah, no, this is such an important issue. And, I think when it comes to technology and equity, but new solutions in general, I think the general rule is that if you take a kind of universalistic one-size-fits-all solution, it will generally tend to advantage the most dominant groups. And this tendency is particularly strong for solutions that rely on technology and novel technology. So there's a tendency first to want to have like a universal platform that is about equality rather than equity. And there's also often the desire to have the most technically sophisticated solution. And those are both tendencies that will, by definition, default to the dominant norm and give more. It's not that it doesn't give advantage to less dominant groups, so it will give more advantage to groups that are already well connected. There's work that Carmen Gonzalez and Vicky Katz did in the US context around some, digital divide efforts of giving laptops and connectivity to low-income, immigrant families, families of color. And they found like really problematic dynamics where, especially in the US, where we have a large undocumented immigrant population, even when families were offered laptops and free internet from schools, because the schools hadn't addressed the concerns about safety and privacy effectively, that those families just opted out of these resources. And that's sort of an example of, not tailoring the solution to the needs and concerns of the most vulnerable groups. So if you're really concerned about equity, it has to be about equity and not equality, and that really starting with the needs of the most vulnerable groups. And the work, it's also really clear that that starting with kind of the more tailored solution for vulnerable groups is more likely to advantage everybody than starting from like really fancy technology and the more powerful groups. So I'll give an example of a pilot that one of my he's a professor now, but he was a postdoc with me when he did this, Alex Cho, where, we were trying to solve the problem of why it was so hard for lower income families to access out of school learning opportunities, even free ones, right? It wasn't an economic problem. And we found that while there were a lot of clearinghouses that relied on kind of web and email communication to get information of this kind out to families, the lower income families in our community really didn't have the bandwidth to be accessing like visually intensive emails and web pages. And he designed a text message system that was specifically around opportunities that were free or below a certain cost threshold, where it was communicated through text messaging. And that just took off. So it's a very simple solution, a solution that can work for everybody because text is now the common denominator. So those are the kinds of design mindsets that I think are really quite important if you're focusing on equity. I think the other dynamic in like a racially fraught and unequal context like the US is that more and more we're seeing that young people in minority or stigmatized groups are not finding that the open internet is a safe space for them and are moving into sort of more private, safe spaces of refuge. One of my colleagues, Tara Tanksley, has been doing a lot of work on young Black women and their experiences on the internet and how they create spaces of healing and safety and refuge online. And we have a series called Spaces of Refuge that talk about some of these design moves of creating kind of more safe spaces of psychological safety and the platforms, how they can support them in different ways. So I think it's like, Black women and girls within the US centered internet often encounter a really hostile environment. And while it's important, obviously, that they have access to these broader, open internet resources, it's also really important when we have a focus on things like safety and well-being that we support and create spaces where they feel more protected and safe given the hostility of the broader ecosystem.
That is fascinating and very rewarding. And I know me working on the safety team here at Meta, that's one thing that we always look towards, right? What are the things that are being inadvertently highlighted, right, by the technology? And in this case, it's unsafe conversations for some people. And then what are the simpler ways that, and the simpler tweaks that sometimes will take us to much better, more safer conversations, but also spaces, right? That the ones that you were mentioning. So I'm very eager to learn more about these projects that you've mentioned. And that's very, it just presents much more learning opportunities. And so one thing that I wanted to take from this and ask you a little bit more about is not only more of these successful experiences, the more examples you bring, I think the best for our community. But specifically youth participation, right? I think you've mentioned this a few times. It is part of the work that you all do. And I'm very interested in understanding how would you recommend for educators, for policymakers, for companies, for developers, for anyone working in both the tech and the well-being spaces, to integrate direct participation for youth? One of the goals, right, of Safer Internet Day in Brazil and today with SaferNet is to highlight precisely new digital strategies that can support the well-being of youth, but by directly highlighting youth's participation, right? And how can their participation be a game changer for programs, for policies that we're designing, for tech that we're designing? And if you can help us and guide us through investigations where you learn more about young people's insights and how can those be better integrated into processes, right? As opposed to just talking about what happens to them, bringing them in the whole process safely.
Yeah. So I think, I've already mentioned some of sort of the pitfalls with a very top-down, adult-driven approach when dealing with youth. So I think, at the broader level, at a cultural level, just, the mindset of young people as an asset and a source of solutions rather than problems to be fixed. Like just shifting that mindset, because we're always looking at children like as adults, how can we fix them rather than they are the source of the solution? So that's like a big kind of design and mindset shift. The number one complaint that young people usually have about adults is they don't listen and they're not curious and they don't ask. So approach young people with a spirit of open-mindedness, less judgment, and more curiosity. So I think that mindset is the first thing. And then recognize also that young people are incredibly diverse and have different interests, different strengths and dispositions. And there's leaders and in these spaces and young people who don't really care to get involved. And so just like you would seek talent within the grown-up world, don't assume like just because you have one young person on your design team or you've done one focus group that you've checked the box. I see a lot of that tokenistic stuff. It's like, no, you need to engage with young people just as you would look for a collaborator or partner who's a grown-up. They should be a respected part of the design team and not just being asked to represent young people as a category. So I see a lot of that. I'll be sitting around a room and there'll be like one or two young people, or there'll be a panel at a session. And you feel like, okay, you've checked that box of youth participation. It has to go much deeper than that. It has to be the same kind of relationship and respect that you would bring to another person on your design team. And ideally, the advanced version of this is that you actually empower youth and communities to make those design decisions to create spaces on their own. And that's where I think, for platforms like Facebook and Meta, or whether it's Discord or Minecraft or all these other platforms that young people are on, to the degree that you can create tools and openings for communities to set their own standards, create their own spaces that might be different from the norms, the community guidelines, from the open internet part of it. I think that is very empowering. And there's a reason why during the pandemic, platforms like Discord and Minecraft took off, because they are spaces where communities can set up their own servers, manage their kind of membership and privacy in ways that are really specific to the needs of those communities. And I think as the internet just gets bigger and more diverse and more polarized, it's important. Like the open part is also incredibly important, but it's a both and. Like it has to be always counterbalanced by the ability of young people or any other non-dominant group, right? It's like age is just one other form of oppression among many other forms of oppression, to be able to set standards and create and grow their communities. Like that's really it's kind of this big sort of balancing act that the internet always has to is always going through. And we're in a phase where it's like, you talk to young people, it's like, oh, I may be following influencers on Instagram, but I would never comment. I would never actually participate in the open internet because it doesn't feel safe. Participation happens in my text message group, or maybe in my Snapchat, or places where I know exactly who is in that group. And so as the internet gets bigger and more toxic, those spaces of refuge are even more important. So again, I've been plugging our Spaces of Refuge series, but some examples of how, organizations and groups can help young people mediate that. We did a co-design process with a computer clubhouse in our region called Disco America that serves Latinx teens, and worked with them to co-design. Well, they really did it. We were kind of there to watch and learn. A Discord server that became their sort of social hanging out space during the pandemic. But it was really something that was kind of driven, it was their idea, their interests, and it's a model that they are being ambassadors for other community-based organizations. Like, what does the digital, not the like online learning, but what does the digital social space of our learning institutions look like? Most attention of educators has been on like academics and like continuing to push content. But where are the playgrounds? Where is the hallway? Where is the place that kids are hanging out when they're stuck at home? Like, that's the part that hasn't been addressed. And then I'll give a plug for our own nonprofit, Connected Camps, where during the pandemic, we've always had a free Minecraft server for kids to hang out, but we expanded the hours of that server during the pandemic. And we work with, like, the grownups don't actually moderate or teach within our programs. We hire college age gaming nerds to mentor 8 to 13-year-olds. So again, we provide sort of the resources and support and training for young people to do kind of the adulting part of it. But they're the ones that actually bring the assets and expertise for how to create safe and enriching online spaces. And of course, a 13-year-old is so much more excited to hang out with an 18-year-old than a 50-something, professor. So I am never at the front lines of, the work with the young people, but I'm just really proud of our young adults who are really the face of the programs for the children and families.
I love hearing this. I am going to emphasize this, and you're going to see it in the comments, Spaces of Refuge. And I know that that we'll be providing the links, but I love hearing about this, and I love hearing about the balance, as more of like big picture thinking. This is not one company's issue. It's not one educational institution's issue. It's not one country's issue either, right? We should look at it and how does everything complement, but those of us who are working to understand youth or educators and parents who are working directly with them is also understanding the myriads of offers, right? That and the possibilities that they need and what they can use each tool for. They're not going to use one tool for everything, and that's as it should be, right? You mentioned something with the Spaces of Refuge at the end that I am very keen on honing down on, and this might be like leading to the end of our session, but peers, right? And peer-to-peer communication and the power that brings. You just mentioned that with the mentorship opportunities that you're all creating or that they are creating. And it's true, right? All of us look to our peers for reference. And that's especially true for teens. And it's especially true for teens who are looking to feel safer or for safety situations, right? They not only want to feel like they share the social and emotional developmental, stage at that moment. They also look to their same peers as influencers. You mentioned that too. And so what's the balance and how do we help balance and amplify access to qualified and appropriate mental health, well-being resources and services, while also amplifying the importance, right, of this and the power of this peer-to-peer communication? What are the tools that we as adults or as companies, as educators, as researchers can provide to help them form that space, that safe space?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate your bringing this up, and also, just your participation in these conversations as, somebody who is on the front lines of this at the platform level, which I think is incredibly important. And, I've been highlighting the power of young people and their agency, but frankly, this is one of these areas where it's really important not to make it an individual responsibility. Like you said, it's a systemic, ecosystemic responsibility that's not just one platform. And it's also includes policy and educational organizations. And one of the big missing pieces that I see in the ecosystem, I see young people doing all of these amazing things, like given the limited kind of agency and tools many of them have. But what I don't see is sort of trusted intermediary organizations like you might have within, the traditional educational space that are kind of like, it shouldn't be up to the commercial platforms to solve all of the issues of the public sphere either, right? I mean, we all have to stay in our lanes to some extent, but I think the slowness of policy to catch up with the changing of technology is one thing, but there's actually, like, if you look at something like historic interests, like in the US, we have little leagues around baseball, and there's these sort of networks of community-based organizations that help scaffold adults to mentor kids in baseball, and that have a set of standards for what good sportsmanship looks like and what to do when there's like a big problem. And these are sort of networks of community-based organizations that make parks and baseball fields safe spaces for kids. It's not like there's a commercial industry around baseball. There's a little bit of public policy, I suppose, but there has to be, like, the people have to be participating through these intermediary organizations that make the internet a good place for kids. And that's where I haven't seen a lot of investment. Our little nonprofit Connected Camps is one example where we're a nonprofit and we take, we work with big platforms like Roblox and Minecraft and Discord, and we create a set of standards for a range of organizations and programs to localize that into a kid-friendly, educational, connected learning environment. I think it's quite difficult for the platform providers to do all of that work, and it's not really their place to do it. So that's the part where it's like, there has to be, like, of course, I really appreciate anybody doing design the big platforms involving youth. So this is not to say don't do that. But I do think there's really a role for, whether it's research or nonprofit organizations or community-based organizations, to have more power in this space to mediate between the interests of diverse youth and communities and the big platforms. I'll give a plug to some other organizations that are doing this within the gaming space, which is, the space that I've been most focused on recently. So Raising Good Gamers is an example of a coalition that's sort of building positive gaming standards. There's organizations like Take This, which is around mental health and gaming, Fair Play Alliance, which is around inclusion. Cartoon Network has done a really interesting Play Positive campaign. And of course, Facebook, Meta, Google, all the big platforms are doing more and more work in this area. Sort of the professionalization of roles like yours, I think, is really, really important to continue to elevate and amplify the needs of youth and diverse communities within the context of these very complex companies and platforms. I mean, this is the struggle you face every day. And I really just appreciate, the good work that I'm sure you're doing within the context that you're operating in.
And I'm sure there's tons more to do. And what I really appreciate is all the feedback, right, that you're bringing not only to us, but with SaferNet, bringing us together here today for Safer Internet Day. In a minute, you guys will hear, everyone will hear from the youth themselves, the ambassadors from the Digital Citizen Program in Brazil, which has trained over 90,000 students. And so you'll hear their ideas, you'll hear what they're coming up with. And so I think spaces like today's and what, thank you, Rodrigo and team, SaferNet is doing is actually bringing us all together so the lessons are finally taken from one place to another, right? There's a role for platforms to listen and to develop certain tools, but there's also a role for very community-based thinking, right? What is important and what is resonant and, in the local language, in the local culture, right? For youth to get involved, and what are policymakers, what can they learn, right, from all of this interaction so that the policies are forward-looking, like you say, stop what needs to be stopped, but also think forward about how do we design better, not only spaces, but in general, better possibilities for interaction online and offline. So Mimi, I very much thank you for all these wonderful examples, for sharing your wisdom with us, and the wisdom of all those who work with you, especially the youth who've shared through you their cultural learnings and everything they want everyone else to see. So I don't know if you have any final remarks. I would love to close down this session by thanking you and thanking SaferNet for this space.
Yeah, so I'll just echo that. I think conversations like this and organizations like Safer Internet that are bringing people together are kind of essential in this day and age, and really appreciate the opportunity to be able to participate in this conversation. The last just sort of wish or hope for this group that I'd like to leave you with is, during the pandemic, all of us had the experience, grown-ups who are not tech savvy as well, to live the life of young people, of being highly reliant on digital technologies for essential social connection and play. Remember that we've limited young people's ability to do a lot of things in physical spaces even before the pandemic. So we lived the reality of teens for a significant period of time. And I know we're in a moment where we're just in a rush to get back to normal, whether it's in education or social life, and we're aching for those in-person connections. But as we return to real life, hopefully soon, please don't forget the lessons and experiences of the pandemic, and don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and carry forward those positive experiences even as we return to the life that we missed.
Better said, impossible. Thank you so much, Mimi.